Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to wait another few seconds for a few more people to come in. I'll first introduce myself. I'm Siddhartha Shah, the curator of South Asian art and the director of education and civic engagement at the Peabody Essex Museum. And I'm really, really glad to welcome you this evening to our program. I will say that this whole process started from various angles. One is that I was a juror recently on a art and essay writing competition for South Asian Americans. And it was asking South Asian American youth to think about how their bi or multicultural ethnic identities intersected with the civil rights movement in the United States, particularly how South Asian identity can support the Black Lives Matter movement. And the competition was timed with the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the bridge crossing and the walk from Selma to Montgomery, and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And so that made me think that this is a moment in history that had not, I as an Indian American had never, I don't remember ever learning about this in my history classes in high school or junior high. So it seemed like an important part of American history to think about and reflect on, particularly after the 2020 election, when the Black and brown vote was so important to the outcome. Another reason was that I am on the City of Salem's Race Equity Task Force, on a committee that's tasked with community culture. And as a part of those conversations, one of the ideas that came up was that different organizations or institutions or groups in Salem should host an event once a month. That's all it would be, once a month, to help Salem become more aware of racial inequities in our community and in our country, and to ultimately become an anti-racist city and community. And the third reason is, I was asked pretty recently, like, why would the museum do this? Why would the Peabody Essex Museum host a virtual film screening of a film that you can find on Amazon Prime and pay $3.99 for, or some other avenue? Why would we do this? And my immediate internal response was that as an institution that comments on the history of American identity and global connections, it is our responsibility to talk about histories that have not been prioritized in museum spaces and that require revisiting over and over and over because they have so many lessons for us to learn. And so that is why we hosted this virtual film screening and this conversation today. So before introducing Dr. Walter Harper, who I'm so happy to have with us this evening, I just want to say that in our conversations, something has become very, very clear to me. We come from very different backgrounds and different moments in time. And yet there are remarkable points of connection and similarities that we share. We both have an interest in religion. We have an interest in psychology and psychoanalysis, education and service, as well as we're both native Illinoisans. But we also have our own American experiences, our experience of being born, raised, and living in this country. And so I think it's important for us to bring those experiences together in the space of this kind of conversation. So please let me introduce and welcome Dr. Walter Edward Harper Jr. Dr. Harper was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. He attended Loyola University of Chicago, where he received many awards, wrote a weekly column for the school newspaper, and was the president of his senior class. After receiving a bachelor's in history with an education minor, Walter also earned a master's degree in counseling psychology at Loyola and a teacher education program certificate from the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis. He has worked as an elementary school teacher, a child care worker, a college admissions officer, financial aid officer, a counselor therapist, public health community educator, and social services agency program administrator. Later on, Walter earned a PhD in anthropology at Brown University, where he completed 2 graduate student teaching certificate programs and was an honorable mention for the President's Award for Excellence in Teaching. He has worked as an adjunct professor at Salve Regina University, Tufts University, the University of Rhode Island, and completed a 3-year appointment as visiting anthropology department scholar at Brown University. Currently, he's a visiting associate professor of anthropology at Bridgewater State University. His scholarly research interests focus on the anthropology of childhood, anthropology and United States culture, educational anthropology, ethnicity and race studies, gender, psychological anthropology, social and educational inequality, and urban anthropology. So thank you so much, Walter, for joining us this evening.
Siddhartha, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this wonderful program.
You bet. So I thought we could start. One of the concerns I had, let me just back up and say, is that when we watch a movie, sometimes we, especially a movie based on historical events, it's important to remember that this is inspired by a very real, important moment in history that lived through by real people. These are not made up fictional characters. And so I thought we could maybe open by sharing some personal associations that came up through watching this film. So I'll just start with 2 things that came up for me. The first was a memory I have from childhood, but it's a story I have heard countless times. My parents immigrated to the United States from India in the late 1960s. And my father he's a retired ear, nose, throat surgeon. And there was a moment shortly after arriving in the United States where he knew how to do these really specific, difficult surgeries. He was hired to do these very, very precise surgeries. There was a moment when he learned that a fellow physician on the team, a white man, who was not able to do the surgeries that my father could do, was making about twice as much as my dad was making. And it felt like, these are my words, like he'd been punched in the gut. This recognition that he was undervalued and that there was no one he could go to seek equity in that space. And I imagine that's something that other people who are listening can relate to, particularly women. I just think with pay inequity, of doing as much, if not more, than others, and knowing that the system is such that you will not be paid for your work fairly. The other thought that came to mind in watching this was a memory from my childhood. I was maybe 3 or 4 years old, and we were living in Illinois, and my family was going to a restaurant for dinner. We walked in, and so I was 3 or 4, my brother was 9 or 10 years old, and it was my parents. And my parents are very Indian looking. My mother wears Indian clothes, has a red dot. We walk in, and there was a man sitting at the bar in there. And I have to say, you know, anytime the United States has been in conflict with a country in the Middle East, or I'll just say with the Islamic world, we become that to people. So in 2001, living in San Francisco, people would make Taliban comments to me as I'd just be minding my own business. But in this moment, in the early 80s, we walked into this restaurant, and there was a man at the bar who looked at us really aggressively and kind of like he was angry, and started saying things and then started shouting things while we were just waiting to be seated. And I don't remember if it was the manager or the host, but someone from the restaurant came up and said to my father, it doesn't seem like this is going to be like you should stay. I really recommend that you go somewhere else because this person is being really difficult. And we left. And as we were walking to my car, my brother said, "Daddy, why are we leaving? Why aren't they not asking the other guy to leave? Why do we have to go?" And my dad just said, "Well, we are different. We are immigrants. We're different from Americans. And so this is just how it is. We have to go. And even as a child, I remember feeling like something about this is not okay. How am I not an American when I'm born and raised in this country? So those memories came to me in watching this film. So I wonder if you might share either a comment or something of your own experience.
Well, Siddhartha, when you talk about immigration, despite the fact that my forebears had been in the United States of America for a long time, prior to, I would say, even World War II, the majority of African Americans that lived in the United States of America lived in the South. And my mother and father opted prior and just after World War II to move to Chicago, Illinois. And in terms of immigration, you'll find similar patterns of immigration with immigrants who've come from outside the shores of the United States of America to the African Americans that left the South to move to the North, either for greater opportunities, especially in terms of work, or for better social conditions. And the interesting thing in my neighborhood on the South Side of Chicago, you would literally have a particular town, either, in Alabama or in Georgia. And in that particular block, many of the people that lived on the block lived in the same community in that particular area of Georgia, which was very interesting to me. In terms of social inequality, despite the fact that, at least the social conditions weren't as horrific as they were in the South, at the time I was living in Chicago, Chicago was known to be the most segregated city in the United States of America. And there were definitely barriers. For an example, if you would go to a department store, and the department store at the time was Marshall Fields and Company, I could never touch anything because the rule was if I touched something, as an African American person, my mother would have to purchase it. Okay. At the time, the swimming pools were segregated. Many of the schools were segregated. Even the cemeteries were segregated. When I was born in Chicago in 1950, all the hospitals were segregated. So I was born in the Negro Hospital at the time, Provident Hospital. So you had all these barriers. However, one thing I want to share with you is this. Unlike the experience that you had with your family in the car, my experience and the experience for many of my African American peers was like this. Our parents very rarely talked about these terrible things. I think in many respects because they want to protect us from it. Okay. So we were aware, but this wasn't an everyday conversation in my home and many of the homes of my peers. Okay. So the one thing that a Hollywood picture can depict is, well, of course, this was a message or this was a concern that all African American people were aware of, but they missed the little small things that has not been exactly shared. And I think unfortunate that this lack of a historical perspective or social science perspective kind of works against a particular message in terms of what it meant to be an African American in the United States of America, prior to the 1970s or 80s. But even now, you have so many problems too as well. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. But I want to, and I also want to encourage those in the space with us to put questions into the Q&A box. But I'm touched by the fact. I mean, I don't know if this is the right point of connection, but I've often talked about the fact that like I don't remember that I'm Indian unless people are. I don't see myself as I'm walking in the world. I see the world. I'm not reflecting on my skin color or these things, but it's when other people remind me that I am different, that comes back into mind. But when you say that this was not something that you like talked about, um, is it that you didn't talk about the inequities, or you didn't talk about like the movements?
Well, probably both. Let me give you an example. there was a historic experiment conducted by the African-American couple that both had PhDs in experimental psychology from Columbia University in New York City. It was Cleniff and Mamie Clark, and they performed which now is considered to be a bit of a controversial psychological experiment, was the Dow preference study. And so they asked a group of young African-American children in Harlem their thoughts about how they felt about the African-American doll and the Euro-American or the white doll. And to make a long story short, the preference was for the white doll. The white doll was better, white doll was good, the black doll was bad, on and on and on. But this was the last question they would ask. Which doll is like you? And a number of the children, Siddhartha, ran out the room screaming. I think what my parents wanted to protect me from, I only can speak for my family, was the more psychological, the horrific psychological implications of what it meant to be African American. But at the same time, when I would leave my home and especially go out to the greater community, I was reminded all the time that I was African American or other. And so you learn internally, or you learn your own unique way in terms of dealing with it, especially if you were addressed in a way that was extremely negative. So I can tell you this, if I got paid 5 cents for every time I was called the N-word, from the time I was even from early childhood to 18 years of age and even after, I'd be a multimillionaire. But I did learn from my parents the resiliency in terms of what, whatever someone would say about you negative, you never own. And especially because you have your own personal dignity. So I was lucky enough to grow up in a family where that was communicated daily. But in terms of what was going on outside, in terms of the civil rights movement, very rarely shared. But let me say this, and especially for our audience today, I was very close to a Roman Catholic priest who at the time very much embraced the social justice movement in the United States. And that was a particular movement that was going on in the Roman Catholic Church, because at the time I was attending a Roman Catholic school. And in fact, I spent 10 years studying to be a Roman Catholic priest. Well, anyway, Father Morrisroe asked me if I'd be willing to go with him down south to March, voter registration. I was all set to go. But the very 2 days before I was supposed to leave to go with Father Morrisroe, my dad tabled it. He says, no, son, you can't go. And the sad thing is, Father Morrisroe, as soon as he got down there, he got arrested, and he was in the same cell with Stokely Carmichael and a number of other noteworthy civil rights leaders at the time. They're all members of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And 2 or 3 days after Father was arrested, they allowed him to go. And as he was leaving, he got shot twice in the back, and he almost died. And so when Father came back to Chicago, of course, he could never resume his duties at St. Columbus Church. And it made it very difficult for him to kind of figure out where was he going to go from there. And unfortunately, but maybe fortunately, it's his decision, he decided to leave the priesthood. So, it was dangerous at Siddhartha, to engage in particular activities that may not seem so heavy. It seems heavy duty now, but it was all the more dangerous. And when you see a film like Selma, it very much highlights the number of young people that were involved in that march, but primarily because it was much more dangerous for African-American adult male to engage in this particular type of march. But at the same time, too, to get back what you were saying about religion, many people don't realize that the civil rights movement in many respects was more than a secular movement. It was a religious movement. And the base was the church. And the church was one of the few institutions in the United States of America that was run by African-American people. And Dr. King, unlike other leaders, African-American leaders before him, he had a base, and that base was the church. But because he was a Christian, it also allowed him to draw participants from other faiths, even Jews, whatever, who also believed in his own vision of social justice, because they believed in the greater good of man. And the nonviolent approach was the cement that cemented it all together. I'm talking too much right now, but
No, you're not at all.
But no, those are some of the things that were going on. And so since I decided to be a Roman Catholic priest when I was very young, I was very aware of this particular movement or movements, but not so much in terms of the terrible things. I knew things were terrible, but not the incidental things that you would see in Selma. Because quite frankly, when I watched the film, it put a bad taste in my mouth, and it wasn't pleasant to watch. Even when I watched the Selma March, the first one on television, my dad turned the television off because he didn't want us to see it. But reading about it in the newspapers, I knew it was a terrible thing to happen. Just like the bombing of the girls in the church, a month and a half after the great, March on Washington and I Have a Dream speech. It was just horrific.
So this is really something I want to ask you about, is that bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which appears in the film early on in the film. This is, I'm speaking now as a South Asian, as someone who's Indian American. When we in India see acts of violence take place in a house of worship, it tends to be from people of a different religion who are opposed to that faith. So it'll be Hindus or Muslims or whoever. I mean, that is just like the one that comes to mind now. But what was striking to me, and to me, I've always felt I'm very against violence, but like hospitals, schools, houses of worship, these are not areas for attack. So I was quite struck as an Indian American seeing like, wait, but are these not Christians who are hurting a Christian house of worship? So could you share, I mean, if you have anything to say about that?
I think this is another area, Siddhartha, and I really appreciate you raising this, is the history of organized religion in the United States of America. And unfortunately, organized religion had a lot to say in terms of justifying the slave system in the United States of America. I think historically, even outside the shores of the United States of America, in terms of colonialism, you had Jesuit Franciscan priests serving as missionaries, part of the same process as far as justifying how one particular nation can take over another. There was another issue in the United States of America too, as well. Because of this legacy, the legacy also highlight this particular notions that African-American people were less than human. And if any African-American person would take the initiative to go against the grain, or what they used to call then racial etiquette, then Euro-American white people had the right to keep them in their particular place. And with this particular group, which would now probably be viewed as a terrorist group, they felt that in order to, to eradicate or to thwart that particular movement in Alabama, whatever, what they did was justifiable, either as members of an extremist group or a group like the Ku Klux Klan, because many people don't realize that the Ku Klux Klan did not only object to African-American people, they also objected to Jews and the Catholics and to new immigrants coming to this country. So that's one of the ironies of the church. And for me as a seminarian, I had to reckon with very early, how could I be a member of organized church? But at the same time, organized church was quite racist, because I'll share this with you. Dr. King said something that was very startling. He said that, if I can quote him properly, he said that the most segregated day in the United States of America is on Sunday, when people go to church. And that made me realize the situation I was in, but at the same time too, it also helped me work through at a very early age, how do you reckon with that? How can you be a member of an organized religion, but at the same time too, you don't buy into the racism, but you also want to let people know there's a wonderful message that can bring people together. And that's what Dr. King was very effective in doing, letting people know that there's this strong message that can tie us all together.
I once heard from a guru in India that if you're thinking about religion, like organized religion or your faith, let's say you're a person of faith and you have questions about your faith, that you should be able to test it, you know, like put it through the fire, break it, do all these things, and let whatever holes there are just fall away. And what you're left with that resonates with you can be what you have faith in. And so it gave a lot of, it empowered the faithful to question safely. Like if you can't question that, then like what can you question? So I thought that was like a really nice approach, and it resonates kind of with what I heard you say too.
And so, Hartha, you had theologians at the time, during my time, especially when I was a senior in high school and in college, that, you know, that promulgated that particular that point of view, people like James Cone and others.
Mm.
But since I had to read, you know, works from great theologians, a number of theologians were grappling with that particular issue, and often to the disdain of people within their own organized religious group.
Mm.
Because many young people especially don't realize that Dr. King was not well liked, especially during the last 3 years of his life.
Mm.
Even among African-American Baptists, you had African-American Baptist preachers, ministers that didn't particularly care for him.
And what was,
I'm remember Thursday, right? You know, his last year, he was the most hated, you know, person in the United States of America, as opposed to now where he receives all these accolades, whatever.
Mhm.
But it was totally different, and especially the year that he died in 1968. What that great man experienced over the course of 39 years is unbelievable. I think someone said that when they did an autopsy on him, on his body after his death, they said that he had the body of almost like someone twice his age, the amount of stress that he was under.
Wow.
But it gets back to a quote that I shared with you when I first had the opportunity to meet you about a month and a half ago by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I thought that he was probably one of the most, you know, I didn't exactly embrace him as a high school student, but in learning more about Dr. King, one of his quotes really spoke to me, where he says this, he says, "Show me a hero and I'll write you a tragedy." That's when I realized the greatness of Fitzgerald.
Mm.
As I became more mature and became more aware of the world, and I began to really embrace someone as great as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Well, you say things in those comments that just that bring up so many different questions. I'm thinking of the scenes in the film that show the strain of that work on his personal relationship and on his family. Of course, you can imagine he was on the road a lot. Coretta Scott King is there with children, that very human side of things, as well as that this idea that we have that somehow that he is supposed to be perfect, or that Mahatma Gandhi was supposed to be perfect. Like those who are fighting the good fight are somehow supposed to be superhuman, when actually those fights are being fought by people who are deeply human and deeply flawed, as we all are. And so I really kind of picked up on some of that in the film as well.
And you're doing something, Siddhartha, by saying that. I was just reading the other day a compilation of articles written by an African-American historian. His name was Nathan Huggins. And at one time, prior to his death, he was professor of African-American studies at Harvard University. And if my memory serves me right, the first director of their Du Bois Institute.
Mhm.
And there's a piece. Now, this book was compiled by his daughter after his death, where he's talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he was talking about, in terms of historical inquiry, many people make the mistake of looking at him in terms of the great man approach, in terms of historical inquiry. And really, it works against him as a human being.
Yeah.
And what Huggins is arguing that, you know, though King was a major spokesperson and a pivotal figure in the civil rights movement, it kind of offsets all the other people that were very much involved, the times that lent to social change, but also gets back to what you're talking about too, that we're all human and we have our positive sides and we have sometimes our negative sides too as well. So in order to see him, you had to look at the full picture of who he was. And I thought that the film attempted to highlight that.
So this is the idea that we have a positive and negative is something that brings me to the question around nonviolence. So Mahatma Gandhi, obviously in the Indian context, is known for rallying around a nonviolent revolution. And Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was inspired by the work of Gandhi. I was when I mentioned at the start that there was this, I was a juror for this competition. And when the young students were awarded, Mahatma Gandhi's grandson was one of the people who was there, Raj Mohan Gandhi. And he's mentioned in his talk that in 1936, 4 African Americans went to India, 2 men and 2 women, to meet with Gandhi. And they had a 3-hour meeting where Gandhi told them in 1936 that the efforts and the struggle of African Americans for justice would inspire the world to fight this fight moving forward. And yet, if we all have a positive and negative side, I'm gonna hazard a guess that the positive side is the one that believes in nonviolence, that believes that I will peacefully protest, I will use my right to vote, voting will be my, my statement. But I have to say, when I was in college, I did a semester abroad and I was in Tibetan communities in North India. And I met a number of outspoken Tibetan people who were angry at the Dalai Lama. They were angry that their spiritual, and he's the spiritual leader, but also the political leader, was telling them to not be violent, to what they saw as sit back and watch. And there were people who were like, I've lost my home. I lost my family. I've lost my country. When I live in exile, I am ready to fight. So we have these positive and negative sides. And as the struggle clearly continues, how do we stay connected to that side that remembers the power of nonviolent movements?
Well, that's what gets back to Dr. King's point of view that he used to share, and especially to African American young radicals from the mid '60s to his death in 1968, that being nonviolent, taking that approach, is much more revolutionary than being violent. And I think what many people don't realize is this: his father was a minister, his father was college educated. He went to Europe and he met with people from Germany and other countries where he realized that, I might need to expand my worldview as far as my own personal theology and how that might impact my work as a pastor in Atlanta, Georgia. And remember, Siddhartha, the great Benjamin Mays, a Baptist minister, but he got his PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School. He was president of Morehouse College, and Morehouse used to have a mandatory chapel where Dr. Mays would talk about issues like this to his Morehouse men. But then lastly, I think people don't realize when Dr. King, he was a scholar too as well. Remember, he got his PhD in theology and he was very much influenced by Howard Thurman, who also was able to reconcile, just what nonviolence would mean, or Gandhi's work, or other great theologians' work, or even outside of a Western Christian context. How could a theologian, a budding one, take all this into account to come up with their own particular notion of theology within the confines of their particular denomination, which made him very rare? In many respects, at Arthur, Dr. King probably would be much better suited being a professor at Boston University or a divinity school, Harvard Divinity School or whatever, as opposed to doing what he was doing. But again, he got swept up in the movement and the rest is history. So from the time he left Boston University at 25 to the time that he died at age 39, he had 14 jam-packed years. Because many people, again, don't realize he died at a very early age.
Not even 40.
Not even 40, no.
I think what I hear you speak, I think about how, one of the tenets of certain Hindu or Buddhist philosophies is that when there is an action, do not have a reaction. Right. To actually pause before the reaction. Because if there's action, reaction, action, reaction, action, reaction, the thing just spirals and it continues down that trajectory. But the path of nonviolence can often highlight the violence or the oppression of the oppressive party in a particular way. When to see the footage of the first of the 3 marches is people saw people actually marching peacefully and being attacked. And that the path of nonviolence can often shine that light in a particular way.
Most definitely. And that's what he was reflecting. And it
Mm.
was very effective, especially when people would see things like this on American television. But again, I think these are things that people need to recognize in terms of just the complexity, Siddhartha. I think to truly understand Dr. King, you have to look at history. There's historians that you can look at. In fact, we're very lucky. I mean, folk can get on the red line and get off at Park Street from where you're at, from Salem or whatever. There's a line or whatever, a commuter train, go directly to Boston University. All his papers are there.
Mm.
But they can also learn from someone like you in terms of what? How his work can be reflected, even in one of the past exhibitions that you all had. That Jacob Lawrence exhibition was just fabulous. What I had a chance to see online, it was terrible. I didn't have a chance or opportunity to personally see it. But I think what really speaks to what we're talking about tonight, that particular piece that you highlighted had a lot to say about what we're talking about this evening. And that's what Jacob Lawrence was chronicling. Then I think the other issue is the great social scientists too, in terms of the sociological, anthropological, and psychological implications of what it means to live in a country where you have rapid social change. And what about the individual too as well? What is your relationship to all that change? And what you said so beautifully is this: how do you go about reconciling inequities or irony or contradictions? Because that's probably one of the tougher things I had to deal with as a young person. How do I deal with contradictions? Because often life is just not one way or another way. It's all mixed up. And our charge is to kind of figure things out so we can come up with one path. But you know what the great theologians or writers and mystics all said? In doing that, once we all get to the top, the view is all the same. But we're all coming from different directions in terms of finding that out. So that's why I appreciate the fact that you're bringing that up today for our program.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So one thing I know, I mean, it's hard to talk about, and it's hard to talk about because I want to be really thoughtful in the way I bring this up and the words I use. There is a moment where we see in the film I mean, there's a lot of violence, two particular deaths. One is the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, who is, in the restaurant scene where he's with his father and he is shot. The other is the death of Reverend James Reeb of Boston, the white man who went from Boston to join the cause. And it's after the march where and I was looking into it, and several other priests, I believe, were having dinner and then were attacked and he was killed. And we see that Jimmy Lee Jackson's death happens. And there's like a comment, I think in the film, I don't know if it's real, where Martin Luther King says to Lyndon B. Johnson, like, you called the Reverend's family, but did you call Jimmy Lee Jackson's family? This idea that it took the death of a white man in the way that it was constructed here, but also it drew the nation's attention in a different way. And what's happening today is, if I think about like the death of Philandro Castile, which was like live streamed by his partner who was in the car, we have these moments where today it is the death of unarmed Black people that is provoking movements. And so I do see a change. It does not just, like the deaths of unarmed Black people are being seen and are causing change. But something about those two deaths in the film really struck me, and how differently they were treated.
And especially at the times at Siddhartha, where again, African American people, by many Americans, and I have to be careful because I'm a social scientist, but it was common to hear that they were subhuman, so it wasn't really a loss. You could just push that person away. It might have a connection to the Black Lives Matter movement, but what concerns me is I think that the Black Lives Matter movement needs to have a much more direct connection to overall history in terms of how African American people were perceived
Yeah.
and treated, to all the more empower them or
Yes.
exemplify just the profundity of their particular movement. But Siddhartha, I had to reckon with that, even as a young person, you get a message, it's more psychological, is that you really don't matter. You know what I'm talking, or you're not as important. And if you weren't lucky enough to grow up in a loving home, I was lucky. I grew up in a loving home. Wasn't perfect, but it was loving. I got the message that I mattered. So I never had to hear that from a organization or from a movement outside of me. It was internal with me from my early years. And it really helped me kind of navigate my world, the positive aspects of what I experienced and the negative aspects. And I think what ties us all together, even with you coming from India, a country where, hey, it was a major change in 1947, quite frankly, is the largest democracy today. But even now, they're still reckoning with issues. But that's the beautiful thing about a democracy. If you have turmoil, whatever, there's things in place where you can rectify those things. But there's no way you can ever live in a world or even in a relationship where you're not going to have conflict. But I think what the beauty in Dr. King's message was this: how do you go about finding a resolution for conflict? And how do you treat the person that you're in conflict with? And most important of all, can you still love that person, even if they're not the nicest person in the world? And I think that's the challenge for any Christian in the world today.
Yeah.
And I'm still working that out at
I
my
think
particular junction in terms of life.
so as a Hindu, we would say you've got lifetimes to work this
Oh,
out.
oh my God.
Well, I want to just ask just a few short things, and then we'll go to the questions that have been coming into the chat box. And people, please feel free to contribute more. You mentioned like the need to love even those that we are in conflict with. But with that, I also want to say, that love for self. I mean, we're talking a lot about self-care these days. And when you are engaged in the work, which I call the work with a capital W, you feel that there are forces against you. It is exhausting. It takes a toll on your health. You mentioned Reverend King's body at the stage it was at because of all of the stress he endured. Do you have any thoughts on how we take care of ourselves, love ourselves while we're trying to love those that we're in conflict with?
Siddhartha, I think that's the ultimate challenge that all humans have to reckon with, no matter where you're at, all 8 billion plus of us right now on March the 14th, 2021. I know for myself, it was an interesting journey. I think probably the most important thing is to undertake the journey, as scary as it might be, because you don't know where you're going to end up. The other issue is the social space that you occupy as you're undertaking this journey. I think a lot has to do with awareness. I think the more educated you are, I think education plays a very important role as far as reckoning with this. The more you're aware of, it helps you grow as a person, but it also gives you a base in terms of understanding that you're not the only person that's gone through this. And historically, this has been an issue that all humans had to address. And now all people all over the world. And then I think probably the last thing is, despite all the things that kind of work against this, is to have a sense of hope, which is important. But how do you do that? I think we have to all find our own individual way as far as, discovering hope. And I think that's what I pretty much learned from my years studying psychoanalysis, though I'm not an orthodox Freudian or ardent Freudian, whatever. But what I did learn was this, is that what Dr. Freud pretty much highlighted, which is hardly ever highlighted in any of the texts, is this: psychoanalysis does not offer a cure, it offers an awareness. Are you strong enough to recognize what you have to bear as a human being, pain, whatever. That's what it can offer you. It can't offer you a feel-good solution in terms of what your life. So in terms of therapy, as he would see it then, he probably would change now if he's still living, is that, it only can offer you awareness as opposed to a good feeling.
Yeah.
And that was hard for me to deal with because I got into it thinking that's what therapy can offer.
It's like a medicine that like just really,
Oh, yes.
it's not pleasant.
Definitely.
It's not a pleasant process.
So
But the alternative is even less pleasant. Yeah.
true.
So I'm going to ask you one more question and then go to the questions that have been coming in. And this is just, totally just your opinion. And I'm going to ask you this because I'm asking people this in general.
All right.
What do you think is the civic role of museums? Why do you think it's important for like an art museum, where a museum, it's more than art, but like an art museum to facilitate or engage in these kinds of conversations?
I think, Siddhartha, that museums today in 2021 can play an extremely important role as far as addressing all issues in terms of the public that it serves. And I started learning more about that as I learned more about anthropology. To me, I don't know how you feel about it. A museum is a cultural space where people can go and learn about their particular community, the world. They can encounter beauty, even if the depiction, the image is horrific. It can highlight how that particular artist found some type of resolution in terms of dealing with it. I think that a wonderful thing that your museum just did was the Jacob Lawrence exhibition. I mean, you're only one of 4 museums in the world that's going to show this exhibition. That's one way. I think in terms of education programs, this program, today is another wonderful way that a museum can reach out to people, as opposed to only going by the old point of view or the ancient point of view in terms of a museum. It's only a place that has wonderful pieces or works, whatever, and only a so-called intelligent public can take full advantage of it, whatever. I think, that the mindset has to be expanded to all people, but at the same time, too, a museum can still meet its central role as far as being a very important cog in any community. If it's Salem, Massachusetts, or New York City, or Chicago, Illinois. You know what I'm talking about? So I think that museums are integral in terms of getting messages across. And what better place is a safe space to kind of have these dialogues or kind of advance that particular mission.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I'm going to ask you some questions that have been coming in.
Okay.
One that I just saw came in. I'm not going in order. Sorry, I'm going to be scanning various things here, but this is an important one. Going back to the beginning, Siddhartha, you mentioned not having learned about Selma, but probably about the entire civil rights movement. This is true. At my school in Lake Forest, Illinois, we did not learn about the Korean War. We did not learn about the Vietnam War. History stopped at World War II, and then, it was on to finals. So I was thinking about that as I watched the movie and wonder how we can incorporate this into our curriculum in our schools when it's not part of the frameworks. I don't want my students to have the same ignorance that I feel I have had.
Okay. That's an excellent question, but I think the issue is the audience and the particular community. If it's a public school, it's a bit more complicated because there's community politics and, in terms of voice, there's more avenues or bureaucracy you have to kind of deal with, especially in terms of even choosing the textbooks in a history class or a social studies class or a civics class, or even people in the community. You may have maybe 70% of the people in the community want this taught and 30% don't, or vice versa. Private schools, it's much more amenable because the community has more of a say. So at an independent school or a Catholic school or Episcopal school, or it could be a Jewish school, whatever, there's more room to do that. But the other issue is the families. You know, if you have a young person that comes from a family where there's no books at home, if they have a communal meal and things aren't discussed at the table that kind of revolves around this, that kind of works against it too as well. Because, you know, just watching television is not the best education. You know, is a plus when parents can be there to discuss with their children, whoever they are, what's going on, things like that. But I think in terms of education in this country, education in this country is very political. So that's a tough question to grapple with. I think the first thing I would ask that person is, what community you live in, and what particular school or schools are you concerned about? Who's the superintendent? Who might be the town manager or the mayor? What about the PTA? You know what I'm talking about? And the local politicians, or even a congressperson or the senator. These are all the people you have to bring to the table to kind of work this through.
It's like an ecosystem.
Oh,
It's
yes, it is.
like
You know,
the onus is not just on the teacher, but it's on like all of the people that you just listed.
without a doubt. As opposed to an independent school where parents can play a much greater role and they're much more sensitive to something like this. So it's not as complicated.
Yeah,
You
great.
know?
Thank you. I have two questions here I'm going to kind of bridge together. The first is,
Okay.
in the film, LBJ is ultimately portrayed somewhat sympathetically, as in his contentious scene with George Wallace. Did the filmmakers let him off too easily? Now, I know that, like, in some reading that I was doing, I saw that some people were quite concerned with the portrayal of LBJ because they felt like he really was an ally more than he was represented in the film. Is that something that you know about? I mean, I know that this isn't your area of focus. So.
I do. I'm not a historian.
Yeah.
So that's a question that
No,
maybe a
no.
historian can better answer. But for me, as a lay historian, I read the great works by Robert Caro, who wrote 4 volumes, 5 volumes, maybe, if my memory serves me right, on LBJ. And in reading those wonderful pieces, you start to see just the magnitude of who he was as a person. And again, in terms of his journey from being, you know, a politician in Texas to being a vice president to being a president because of a tragedy. And no, there are some warts there. Language, how we even speak to people, even in terms of places where he would speak to someone, even in the bathroom. I don't want to talk about something like this here during his program, maybe more, you know, after the program is over, in terms of why would he want to talk to people when he's in the bathroom? You know what I'm talking about? Or what he would have to do to push through legislation. But, you know, the the it's clear that he made some major advances during his presidency, despite the fact him using the N word, despite the fact that he could be viewed as crude, despite the fact that there are times, many times, where he wasn't the nicest person in the world. But again, that's Hollywood.
Yeah. And it's also what we talk about, people allowing them to be imperfect. I mean, there are people that I deeply respect who are actually people who are like globally respected. But I have been in a space where like a respected, very respected person said something really homophobic. And I remember I was a teenager that really, it hurt. It really hurt. Because I thought that this person of all people should be okay with it. But actually, I feel that they were reflecting their own background and that they were affecting their own experiences, and I don't actually hold it against them because I really believe that this person would have changed their thoughts and like today, given the knowledge they might have now. So that too. Now another question that kind of relates to what we're talking about the representation of a historic event in a Hollywood film. How was Selma unique for a major mainstream motion picture as it depicts Black history? And are there elements in Selma that you were surprised to see in the film? If there wasn't a Black filmmaker at the helm, perhaps this would have been a very different film. What do you think?
Possibly, you know, and especially for someone like Ava DuVernay, did I pronounce her surname correctly?
I think so.
That's
Yeah.
something that she wanted to take on. I think a lot of it had to do with her being supported by Miss Winfrey
Yeah.
and other constituencies, as far as her being able to, you know, make this more than just an idea, make it to a full-fledged motion picture. But you know, in any Hollywood film, you got pluses and minuses. You have people that are financial backers, that you have to please. I mean, how often does a filmmaker can realize their particular mission as far as what they want to put in a film? You know what I'm talking about? I think the other issue in terms of what you're addressing is just the difficulty in terms of what? Um, just images in general. This is the 21st century, and it's all about images. And unfortunately, that's where most people get their information, from an image, as opposed to a written work, or as opposed to exposing itself to other people that may have played a pivotal role in terms of that particular film, in terms of, you know, the narrative, what have you. And that's what I was talking about before, about Diane Nash not being exactly mentioned, who was a major player for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. My sense is maybe she should have had a much more, a deeper role in terms of the film, if I can use deeper, or she should have been highlighted more. And you know, Siddhartha others. So, you know, it's really complicated. But what do you do? But I'm glad that they made the film. But no, but it's very difficult. But let me tell you this in terms of a filmmaker, and can only a filmmaker of color do this? I think not. I think there was a beautiful film done on African American people that was directed by a Euro-American white filmmaker. And I haven't found anything more sensitive as far as a focus on African American families, and it's Sounder. Sounder was just beautiful. It was lyrical, and it was very moving. And it really got, I don't think there's been any other depiction of an African American family in terms of just the love, whatever, that's ever been seen on screen. But the director was Euro-American.
Yeah,
So,
that totally that totally resonates.
you know, I'm talking about, we're talking about people being human.
Yeah.
And so if that director, producer is human, they can do it. And I think that's what makes our college and university experiences, or even your museum, wonderful. It can be a safe space where you can have these conversations or discourses. And people can leave the museum, or as they spend 4 years at a college or university, slowly but surely, in their own unique way, they can grow and be exposed. But remember, again, I'm an anthropologist, and I'll be the last person to say that one should not embrace difference. I mean, we've been talking about that for over 100 years, though we have a legacy too that's extremely problematic. But you know, difference is a reality. And you know, people have to get with it. Everybody's not going to be a lot like you. So
Well,
get a life.
go ahead, good. No, well, this is like a goal of that.
Mhm.
Can the museum? You know, museums are like a colonialist structure. I mean, it's a little bit like you take from here, you take from there, and you put it all together, and you've got some kind of zoo where you can like travel the world in one space. I love museums. I absolutely, I mean, clearly I do. I work in one, and I'm committed to this. And yet we have to acknowledge the problematic nature of this system and this space. And the way I think we can do it is to create more opportunities that are like a safe space, a brave space where people can be brave and open about sharing these experiences, and that we further this dialogue and communion actually together
With people.
with people.
So, you know, and it has to be, all voices have to be heard. People have to have their voices heard. And that's where you can make it happen, Siddhartha.
I've got a question here that, I mean, you mentioned SNCC a few times, and it does come up in the film. And I don't know if this is something that you feel would be better answered by a historian, but maybe it could just be your opinion. The tension between the SCLC and SNCC was touched on, but not elaborated on. It was not at all portrayed as the tension between violence and non-violence. Did one organization's approach make more sense than the other from our perspective decades later?
I think, Siddhartha, if they would have had more time, but it would have been a 5-hour film.
Yeah.
It was also generational. You had a cohort of African American young people from Fisk University, Morehouse, Tougaloo College, whatever, that had their own distinct view of looking at the world, or how can one go about affecting social change. A number of them did not have a religious orientation, as opposed to someone like Dr. King, you know, It was a religious orientation, but it was also, I think, Siddhartha, a distinction between African Americans growing up in the North as opposed to African Americans growing in the South. For African Americans growing up in the South, religion played a very important role, and their view of Christianity more lent to someone like Dr. King because that's where he come from, as opposed to the North, where, things were allegedly more open, yes and no. You know, it lent toward maybe another approach. And as an example in the film, of course, you have Malcolm X there, okay? And then you have, of course, the young people in SNCC, whatever, that had views that were contrary to Dr. King. But I think, the issue, again, was more generational, also with youth too as well. Making the mistake of thinking that you have all the answers. It doesn't dispel that they're not entitled to their point of view. Their point of view should be heard, but they're still young. You know what I'm talking about? And one of the things I had to learn when I was young is I don't have all the answers. It's important to have the elders to kind of help you work that through. And then sometimes it takes time. But at the same time, too, you don't ever lose your zeal as far as wanting to affect change. You got to keep it, and that's a difficult thing to kind of weigh. And that's what Dr. King was reckoning with, you know. And I was one of those types of people. But I changed because I was lucky enough to have mentors, older mentors that showed me the way. And that's the beauty of being a member of a university or college community where you have learned individuals from all backgrounds that can be that type of person for you. Let me give you an example. When I was an undergraduate at Loyola University of Chicago, I had a contact with a Euro-American woman, and she was one of the first women in this country to get a PhD in biology. But in getting her PhD through her graduate school days, Siddhartha, she was not allowed to be in the lab with the men. In fact, she was literally ostracized. So can you imagine for me at 18 years of age, listening to this wonderful woman, sharing the pain and all the angst that she had to encounter and just all the drama and everything else to get this PhD, but she still got it. And that's when I realized that, what strength is all about. And despite the fact that she was a woman, I think she defined herself as a woman. You have to be inclusive now. I think that's how she identified. I don't want to be disrespectful. And her being totally different from me, I can still learn from her. And so that's what kind of helped shape me. Whereas more than just me being a young male coming from the South Side of Chicago, trying to work this through. Life is a little bit more complicated than that.
Certainly is. Well, I'm going to ask this last question. It's part of a question. Let's end. You mentioned hope. Let's end with that.
Okay.
What are you hearing from your students today that gives you hope?
I think from what I see on the campus of Bridgewater State University and what I see nationally with the Black Lives Matter movement and with the 1% movement and other movements that I see on campus, if it has to do with maybe gender equity or gender expression acceptance or whatever, is that we have a new cohort of people that simply aren't going to accept, other individuals, not acknowledging them for who they are as a person, not in terms of them doing something that is problematic, whatever, but just acknowledging them for who they are, for just their presence. And their presence should not be a barrier as far as them getting an education, getting a job, or how they're treated. And that gives me hope. When I see little people saying things, because my area is children. When I hear comments from children, that gives me hope. You know what I'm talking about? It can be in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, or if I'm on the Green Line in Boston, you hear things from young people, whatever, that gives me hope. Or on my other work. As a teacher, Siddhartha, that's what it's all about. You share a particular perspective with the thought that your students will take that, and as they mature, they in their own way will advance that message. So the message is never lost. So I'm part of a continuum in terms of that. And there were people in my life like Ralph Tyler and Marcel Fredericks, Lena Frazzetti, my advisor at Brown University, Dwight Heath, my advisor at university, or someone like Bill Beeman, that did that for me. And that's what it's all about. And that's what keeps me excited. So I think the issue is to keep that fire, but not in a way where you're hurtful or you inflict pain on somebody. That's what it's all about for me. So does that answer your question?
That is great.
Okay.
That is great. I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us and for sharing your heart and your wisdom and your experience in this space, for making such a safe and open space with me to have this conversation. And I hope that it becomes something that we keep doing at the museum. And I hope that you can come in person and we can meet in real life. And I want to thank all of the people who've attended. This is really, really meaningful that you took the time to watch the film and to hear this conversation and participate. And I really hope it's the first of many, many more conversations like this.
I feel the same way, Siddhartha. I also want to thank Bethany and Corey and your colleagues at the museum for making it very easy for me to kind of have this experience with all of you. And then for all the people that are part and parcel of our Zoom audience too, I'd like to thank them for participating and listening to me for close to an hour, and you too as well, being patient.
Well, it's absolutely been a pleasure. And thank you so much, Walter. I'm sending you love and care and all best wishes. And to everybody here right now as well. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. My peace.
Have a great evening. Bye, everyone. Bye.